This is part of our work to demonstrate personal actions that promote social justice. We'd like to thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we can really get the day started, though, there are a few things we all need to know to make sure that the day runs as smoothly as possible, which I'll go over now. First, as some of you may have noticed as you arrived this morning, some of our classmates have brought along projects which showcase case studies of refugee groups that have settled in Canada. Students and staff are more than welcome to check them out during the lunch break. The washrooms are located right near the school registration tables where you all came in this morning. That's to say, if you leave the auditorium, you will turn right, and then up the hallway, you will turn left. For today's conference, you have all been divided into 3 groups by color: green, yellow, and orange. The workbooks you were given on arrival will tell you which group you're a part of. Could I have those in the green group, so the name will be highlighted in green, so the community. And the yellow group. And last but not least, orange. Your teachers have scheduled that which will determine how the 3 groups will cycle through the workshops that we're putting on throughout the day. But there will also be volunteers with colored signs at each of the workshops, so you'll always know where you're going. Can I ask those who have colored signs with them to stand up now? There we go. Thank you to the student volunteers for accompanying the group through the workshop today. After you cycle through the first workshop, there will be a lunch break. Pizza will be provided in the main atrium where the next workshop is set up. Please note that all the groups are asked to stay in their morning workshop until they're called to get their food. But after you do get your food, students can disperse up to the 3rd floor head up the staircase that's right in the main atrium where the MSF workshop is set up and find a spot to sit on the floor. And while you're eating, please make sure to put all garbage in a garbage can and make sure that no waste is left behind when you move into the afternoon progress. Thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Molly Thornton, right? And I'd like to welcome you to today's youth conference. I would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land in which we are gathered is traditional unceded Algonquin territory that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land before us. Today, I would like to ask that we all take an honest look at what it would feel like to be a refugee in today's political, economic, and social environment in Canada, whether one is arriving alone or coming with family. Perhaps some of you and or your parents have fled your own countries. We are particularly happy to welcome you to today's NDRAMA Youth Conference. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees the right to all to seek and enjoy asylum in persecution in other countries. In contrast to countries that have been less welcoming to immigrants and refugees, Canada takes its commitments to mediate drugs seriously and prides itself on its reputation in the international community as having sensible and attitude to immigration. When certain groups of people were turned away south of the border not too long ago, our Prime Minister was quick to respond. He tweeted, "To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you, regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. #Welcome to Canada." To date, the tweet has been shared over 418,000 times. Canadians follow by welcoming refugees with open arms and hearts. But we still have work to do. Although our Prime Minister has stated that multiculturalism is at the heart of Canada's heritage and identity, 1 of 5 of us would rather immigration be stopped altogether in Canada. And sadly, we see examples of xenophobic attitudes and racism in the news and in social media. Today, as we listen to the experiences of those who have fled their homelands, let us all remember that the vast majority of us are the children of immigrants, many of refugees, and that Canada is all the richer with our beautiful mosaic of cultures. By raising awareness of the refugee experience through conferences like this one, We can foster an even more open and welcoming attitude to refugees than we already have.
All right. Good morning, honored guests, students, and teachers. Today I would like to welcome all of you to the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Mass Atrocities Youth Conference. Seeing all of you here today is great. It's crucial for us as the youth of today to be aware of what is going on around us, and because of the issue of migrants and refugees is such a current and imperative topic for us to learn about, it is so nice that many of us are here together today. You might be wondering, who started this whole momentum to bring 350 students together today to learn about refugees? Let me tell you about the story of a regular Ottawa citizen like you and I, whose actions have had a significant effect for the past 8 years and will continue to do so for many years to come. One day, over 8 years ago, Mr. Norm King approached his local MP, Paul Dewar, with the idea of creating a national day in Canada in order to raise awareness about mass atrocities occurring worldwide. After some lobbying and persistent efforts by Mr. Norm King, in 2010, MP Paul Dewar had a private member's motion passed in the House of Commons to create the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Mass Atrocities. Mr. Norm King helped select the date of April 23rd, the birthday of Lester B. Pearson, former Prime Minister and Canada's only Nobel Peace Prize winner. Since 2013, the Ottawa Youth Conference has been held on April 23rd every year. At this time now, I would like you all to take a moment to stand up. Quietly, please. Your place to work for the crowd. The reason I'm asking you to do this today is because today, Mr. Norm King is going to a cancer treatment. On my signal, let us give all a thunder standing ovation for Mr. Norm King. May all the positive energy and appreciation from everyone make its way to Mr. King today to give him the strength to battle the health challenges he is facing. I would ask that you take a look at the last page of your student workbook. This youth conference would not be possible without the support and generous funding from our partners and sponsors. We do extend a big thank you to all those who have assisted us in making this day possible. I would now like to invite Mr. André Plourde to the podium. Mr. Plourde is the Dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs. For 4 years now, the Faculty of Public Affairs has been our partner and allowed us to host our youth conference at Carleton University. Mr. Plourde would like to offer you his welcome to campus.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to Carleton University and to our wonderful campus. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that Carleton's campus is located on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The Faculty of Public Affairs is honored to be playing host to the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Mass Atrocities again this year. Today's focus on refugees who fled atrocities and are building new lives in Canada is an important one for us here in the faculty. Many of our professors are working closely on issues faced by refugees around the world. In fact, we are Canada's leading university on the subject of migration and diaspora studies. Some 45 professors across our university are teaching and doing research on issues related to human migration and refugees. The subjects you will be discussing today will enable you, our next generation of leaders, to help improve the lives of refugees in Canada and around the world. I wish you all the best in your discussions and invite you to come back and visit us here at the Faculty of Public Affairs at any time. Thank you.
The honor Honorable Minister Ahmed Hussein, who is in charge of immigration, refugees, and citizenship in Canada's government, has spoken eloquently about his experiences as a refugee in Canada. While we were hoping that he'd be able to speak here today, he's unable to do so, and so he's unable to attend. Instead, through the magic of TED Talks, we will hear his inspirational story, and at times heartbreaking, recorded in October 2017. It is one of perseverance and appreciation. As you will learn, Minister Hussein was forced to flee war-torn Somalia with his parents at the age of 15, and eventually landed in Canada when he was 16. From his tales of hilarious moments in Canadian generosity to more trying times and glaring examples of social and systemic racism, Minister Hussein vividly conveys his experiences as a refugee in Canada. While his message is the celebration of Canada's diversity and welcoming culture, he nevertheless underlines that Canada has a long way to go. Here is the TED Talk called My Two Canadas. Please take notes of this 13-minute TED Talk and perhaps focus on: what is the minister's background? How has Canada been generous to the minister? What kind of racism has the minister faced? How has the minister demonstrated active citizenship since landing in Canada?
That would be just on your front page. You have room to take notes. And we'll just let a school come in that arrived late before we start the TED Talk.
I was 15 years old when Somalia was going through a civil war. There was chaos and violence everywhere. My parents and I decided that we had no choice but to flee. We gathered a few belongings, got on the back of a big truck with a few other families, left Somalia, never to return. After a very long journey, I landed in Canada at the age of 16 by myself as a refugee. I found out way after that I landed on the indigenous territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit. I was going through conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt that I was worried, would I be accepted in this new country? Would I succeed? But on the other hand, I was excited about a chance to restart my life and the chance to make new friends. I was 16 after all. The very next day, what I didn't get used to, and still can't get used to, is that cold Canadian winter. That at the time, Canadians were experiencing that year the coldest Canadian winter in a very long time. The very next day, I tried to mail a letter to my mother, and someone told me to go to a mailbox. I had never seen a mailbox in my life, and I was struggling to insert that letter in there in the middle of this snowstorm. A young Canadian woman left her baby in a stroller, raced towards me, and helped me do that. That was my first experience of true Canadian generosity. A few days later, I went to the laundromat. I had never seen a laundry machine before. I asked people, how do I operate this thing? And these guys told me, you need a loonie. I got worried. I thought, what is a loonie? Is it a crazy person? Do I need to bring a crazy person here? And after almost leaving the establishment, another Canadian reached out and helped me do my wash cycle. Unfortunately, they didn't stay long enough to help me figure out the dryer. So I ended up walking back to my apartment with a bunch of wet clothes. But regardless, I was so happy that someone reached out to me in my time of need. I went to high school, joined the track and field team, and myself, the teammates and the coach banded together and bought me a winter jacket. And over the years, making my way through high school, I relied on social assistance and social housing. When I went to university, I commuted 2 hours each way to pump gas at a minimum wage job for $6.85, but I used social housing to also get through university. And through using the generosity and the supports of Canadians, the community services, and working incredibly hard, I'm now able to stand in front of you as the Member of Parliament for York Southwestern, and even more incredibly, as Canada's Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship. Thank you. The second part of my journey is one that may not be familiar to many of you. It is the journey of a country that is incredibly generous and welcoming and diverse, but continues to have challenges in addressing systemic racism and true inclusion. And at the time I lived in Regent Park, Canada's oldest and largest social housing neighborhood, and on many days, on many evenings, I would go for walks. And during the majority of those walks, a police car would screech to a halt right in front of me, and the police officer would swing his door in a dramatic fashion, come at me running, same manner every single time, and ask me, where are you going, what are you doing, what do you have in your pockets, show me your ID. And when I talked to a number of my friends, the ones who had the same skin color as myself confirmed for me that they did indeed go through racial profiling and carding regularly. And every single time that happened to me, it was more humiliating than the first time it happened. Because your neighbors are looking at you, strangers are passing by with a car, through their car windows, they're wondering, what did this guy do to deserve being held on the side of the road? But I did nothing. I was only stopped because of the color of my skin. And a few years later, I worked hard and was lucky enough to be hired as a political staffer. And we were at a reception where the only political staffer in the room was me, who was black. And a prominent Canadian came to me and asked me, are you an entertainer? I found the question to be strange, but I was polite enough to say, no, I'm not. I smiled and I said, I'm a political staffer. He smirked and said, how did you get that job? He couldn't believe it. And I said, well, I worked hard, I went to university, and here I am. He asked again with another smirk and said, no, really, how did you get that job? And I said, again with a very polite answer, I worked hard, went to school, and applied for this job. He walked away shaking his head and didn't ask that question of any other political staffer in the room. A few years later, I became a lawyer, and I was representing a client in Ontario Superior Court. And I wrote the name of my client and my name to be called at the right time by the clerk. And after a few hours of not being called, during the court recess, I asked the clerk, why is my name not being called? She looked at the two names and said, oh, sorry, we thought you were one of the accused. The accused being the only other black individuals in the courtroom who were like me. When these incidents happen, imagine walking on the street and having a parent pull their child closer to themselves because you're walking by. Being followed in a grocery store because of the color of your skin. Imagine, because of the color of your skin, being pulled over by police constantly. These incidents are debilitating, they wear you down, and they make you feel like the other. And even though I got used to a lot of that, it wasn't right and it isn't right. And so it's one thing to talk about identity, it's one thing to talk about racism and privilege, it's another to really live the black experience in Canada. So the experiences of people of color, the struggles they face every day with microaggressions are real. the despair they go through sometimes is real. The feeling that you have that some of the structures around you and the systems are working against you is real. So how do you reconcile this amazing, generous, welcoming, diverse country with these realities faced by some of our citizens? I can go to Parliament Hill today and hold my head high and work seamlessly among my colleagues, shake hands with world leaders, but to this day still worry about getting pulled over by police. But I chose to reflect on what is best about Canada. And I worked hard in Regent Park to come together, use the beauty of the system to organize, advocate, and work with my neighbors to access a $500 million fund. And we were able to revitalize not only the buildings, but the community, our home, Regent Park. And today I have loyal friends who are moving into Regent Park, buying condominiums. The experiences of generosity as well as these other experiences that are debilitating are both real. And as a country, we have to remember that although we remain generous and welcoming, we have a long way to go in our treatment of visible minorities and our challenge with systemic racism. But did you know that in Canada, 9.5% of federal black inmates are black, even though black Canadians only constitute 3% of our population? Did you know that between 2003 to 2013, the number of black inmates in federal prisons went up by 80%? 80%, think about that. Did you know that black Canadians are 3 times more likely to find themselves in a low-income household than European Canadians? What do these statistics tell us? It tells us that we're not a perfect country, that we have problems. But does that mean that Canada is not great? No. I believe Canada is great because we want to do better. And we don't believe in hiding our flaws. That is why we have to have discussions on race, identity, privilege. We have to acknowledge that racial discrimination and a lack of inclusion exists. We have to acknowledge that privilege is real. We have to acknowledge that each one of us has the same opportunities and the same social supports. These conversations are difficult. They're uncomfortable. But we need to have those conversations, because if we don't, it is as if we're saying that we're invisible. That is what it means when you hear the cry of people who say Black Lives Matter. And so, when you examine Canada and you examine what it means to be a great country, I challenge you to reevaluate what greatness means. We have defined greatness in a wrong manner. We should define greatness and look at your personal and professional lives. Look at the leaders that you see. Do you consider a leader great when he or she thumps his or her chest and proclaims their greatness for everyone to hear? Or do you consider a leader great who acknowledges his or her flaws, who listens intently, and who inspires people to action? I challenge each one of you. A lot of people come to me and say, we can't fix systemic racism, I'm only one person. It's abstract, it's big. But we can all check our unconscious biases, like the parent who pulls their child closer when a black man passes by. I challenge each one of you, in addition to examining your strengths, look at your weaknesses. And I know it's hard, because it puts you in a vulnerable situation. But be vulnerable, because through that vulnerability, you'll be able to develop from within, and you can move forward. And being vulnerable as a country is powerful on the international stage, because when countries become vulnerable and expose their flaws to transnational problems like climate change, or our approach to our indigenous brothers and sisters, it's only then that we can work together to correct those flaws. And this is not just an idea of national greatness, it is an idea of individual success. And I'll repeat myself, be vulnerable, be vulnerable, be vulnerable. Because through that vulnerability, you're able to develop and build from within, build yourself, build your family, your community, and yes, your country, Canada. My name is Ahmed Hussein. I'm black, I'm Muslim, I'm a refugee, I'm Canadian, and I am proud. Thank you very much.
Minister Hussein has given us a great deal to consider as we participate in this day of learning about refugees today. It is worth noting that when we hear certain individuals critique that refugees and/or immigrants are a drain on society, we remember that in fact we recognize that migrants who come to Canada make invaluable contributions that make our communities greater. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Hilary Clausen. Hilary is an Aga Khan Foundation Canada Development Champion. Hilary is here to talk today with us about her personal experience as a student working with a refugee family for 1 month in a refugee camp program in Malawi. Her talk is called From University Campus to Dzaleka Refugee Camp. Please note that Hilary will make a question and answer session after her talk. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask and come to one of the microphones on the side. All right, please welcome Hilary.
Good morning. It is an absolute privilege to be here with you today. I love speaking to high school students. I was a high school student myself not so long ago. I won't say quite how long. I am an Aga Khan Foundation Canada Development Champion speaker, funded generously by Global Affairs Canada. Aga Khan Foundation Canada, briefly, is a non-profit international development organization working in Africa and Asia to find solutions to some of our most complex global challenges. Challenges like poverty, like gender inequality, like the refugee crisis. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my trajectory, how I came to be doing this work, to talk about my experience in Dzaleka refugee camp, and to think a little bit more and bring in some of the ideas we heard from the Honorable Minister Ahmed Hussein. So as I speak, I would like to suggest you keep a few things that I heard from his TED Talk in mind. First of all, about how Canada offered him a helping hand. Secondly, about how hard he worked to get to where he is today. And thirdly, that idea about vulnerability, about Canada being vulnerable, even in the great work that we do. So in high school, I was interested in global issues, a lot like you. I started a global issues club that raised money to build a primary school in Kenya. And then in my first year of university, I went to Kenya. I saw the school that we helped to build. More importantly, I saw how eager the children were to run to school to get an education. I saw their parents working so hard to keep their kids in school. I saw the Kenyan government setting up systems so that these children could be in school. So when I went to university, I wanted to continue this kind of work. So I joined the World University Services Canada Student Refugee Program. So this is also about bringing education to young people, this case in university. So what WUS does is it sponsors students from refugee camps to get an education, a university education in Canada. Now I guess you're not quite there yet, but when you head into university, it can be pretty daunting, it can be pretty scary. You heard Ahmed Hussein say that he didn't know how to use a laundromat when he arrived in Canada. And a lot of first-year university students also don't know how to use a laundromat. Nothing unusual there. So everybody faces this difficult challenge heading into university. It's exciting, it's scary. Refugees coming to Canada have additional challenges. So they've arrived here, they're in shock at the weather potentially. They have lost everything that is familiar to them. They've lost the culture that they know. They may be speaking in their second language, their third language, their fourth language even. And in some cases, their education was disrupted in the countries that they had come from because of war. And they're heading into a challenging academic environment. So what the Student Refugee Program does is it matches these students that they're sponsoring to come to Canada and gain a university education with local committees on campus. So Canadian students who can help refugees navigate Canadian society, university life, and make sure they're settling into life in Canada and able to succeed. But not only do the Canadian students help the refugees, but the Canadian campuses gain so much from having these students in Canada. So for myself, I gained a number of new friends. I learned about their cultures, where they had come from, what they had faced, and I saw my own country through the eyes of newcomers. I also met one particular refugee student named Jocelyn. She had come from Burundi. She had left her family of her mother and father and 13 siblings behind to get an education in Canada and start her life here. I also gained a passion for refugee issues and trying to figure out what I could do to help refugees. So I happened to be traveling in Ghana in West Africa, and I decided to go to the Canadian High Commission to ask my country what we're doing to help refugees and how I could be a part of it. So I went to the High Commission, and I went to the Canadian International Development Agency desk officer, so the government's then agency for international development. And I said, I'm interested in refugees, how can I help? And the man looked a bit disgruntled, and he said, that's not development, that's immigration, go down the hall. And I was a bit embarrassed. Here I was trying to help, thinking I knew a little bit about refugees, and I didn't even know which of my government departments was responsible for refugees. So I'll hold that thought there with my embarrassment, and I delved deeper into refugee issues. So I learned that at this moment in history, there are more refugees than there have ever been. So there are about 65 million displaced people, so people that have left their homes or left their countries because of war, because of persecution. Most of them are internally displaced, meaning they haven't crossed an international border. And of those, 22.5 million refugees have crossed into another country. So that is 1 in 113 people in the world that are displaced because of war, because of persecution. Sometimes we think that they're all arriving in Canada, arriving in the West, but in fact most of them either staying in their home countries, the 40-odd million there, or in neighboring countries. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience in Dzaleka refugee camp. So that's of course an example of refugees who have left their home countries and gone to a neighboring country for peace, to start their lives, some in the hope of being resettled in a country like Canada. So as I say, I met Jocelyn in my undergrad, and then when I went on to my master's in African Studies, I decided to research refugee youth in particular in a protracted refugee camp. So this wasn't tent city, it wasn't an immediate emergency response, but it was a camp that had been there for over 20 years. And Dzaleka is in Malawi, in southeastern Africa, just outside of the capital, Lilongwe. And I was very lucky to be able to stay with Jocelyn's family. So it was her parents, 9 of her siblings, and 1 grandchild living in the top left corner there. In this camp, there were 11,000 refugees from Burundi, Rwanda, Congo, and Somalia. So Jocelyn's family was Burundian. And her father had left with the first violence in Burundi in 1972. So he had been displaced for a very long time, and Jocelyn's siblings had been born in this camp. So sometimes we think of refugees as an immediate emergency, but really there are these forgotten people who are stuck in limbo, living in a camp, born in a camp, and unsure what their futures will be. So in this particular camp, the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, provides food to these 11,000 people. So they provide flour, beans, salt, oil. The refugees are not allowed to work. Sometimes the local government turns a blind eye and some refugees drift into town, start small businesses, earn a little bit of money. But then the local Malawians get frustrated because they need jobs as well, and the government cracks down and the refugees all return to the camp. There is an elementary school in camp and there is a high school. The refugees can go to university, but they would have to pay international fees, which is out of reach for most, if not all, of the refugees. So the youth, they get their elementary, their secondary school education, but they can't work, they can't go on to university. So they're basically waiting to start another life somewhere else. Here's a picture of me in the camp with shockingly white legs. I scared the younger children. They thought I was a ghost. And beside me is Mama, so Jocelyn's mother. And one day, her oldest brother, John Jojo, and I decided to go and visit Mama in her garden. Because, of course, what the UNHCR provides is not enough for a family of 12. So we took a bicycle out. Mama, every morning, walks an hour to tend her garden. We rode out to visit her, and we saw her growing pumpkin, squash, cassava, spinach to feed her large family. And then we headed back. On the way back, there was a clunk and a jolt, and I'm sitting on the handlebars of the bicycle, and I say, "Oh, what's wrong, John Jojo?" And he says, "No problem at all. The brakes fell off our bicycle." While I was in the camp, as I say, I was researching how young people spend their time. And the refugee system tends to treat refugees as victims, as vulnerable, as having no power. And yet what I saw were these young people who didn't want to spend their time all day just waiting. They wanted to make a future for themselves. And there was one young man who I interviewed who said, "You know the UNHCR symbol?" And the symbol was all over the camp, from the donated bags of food, from pamphlets. They sponsored the camp, basically. And this young man points out this logo, and he says, look here. We have no arms. We have no legs. We are protected by hands. Who are those hands? Right? And yet, what I was seeing in the camp were these people working so hard for themselves to look after their families and to potentially move to another country, like Mama, who walked 2 hours every day to tend her garden to feed her family. So refugees didn't want to be treated like victims. They wanted, yes, a hand up, a hand out, and then to be able to chart their own destiny. So I spent a little bit of time with 5 leaders of the Burundian community, continuing my master's research. So we were in a building, a large room. It was a little bit gloomy. There wasn't too much light. They were extraordinarily generous. They offered me cookies. They offered me Fanta. Has anyone tried Fanta? If you go to Africa, you'll get Fanta. So I asked a lot of questions, and then at the end, they turned the tables on me. They asked me a question, and it came in Kirundi, which is the Burundian language, so I didn't understand it. All I understood was they asked the question and they burst out laughing hysterically. And I thought, oh, was this joke at my expense? What's going on here? So the question was translated back to me. And what it was the Burundian leader had a stack of paper about an inch thick, and it had all of the names of the Burundian community in Zeleka refugee camp, all of their refugee numbers, their age, their family. And he asked if I could send this package to the Minister of Immigration in my country so that the entire Burundian community could be relocated to Canada. And this was about 2,000 people. And I said, well, thank you very much. I wish I could. That's not really how the Canadian immigration system works. But if you're comfortable, I would like to send it to my government as a message to say, there are these forgotten people who have been in this camp, most of them for their entire lives. They want to start a new life in Canada. They want to contribute to a new society, and they're asking to be moved to Canada. So when I returned home, I sent this package off to the Minister of Immigration, and I got a very nice letter back that said, again, that's not really how Canadian immigration system works, but thank you for bringing this to our attention. So what does Canada do? So as was said in the introduction, we are incredibly generous, and we do sponsor refugees to be resettled. But if you'll recall on one of my earlier slides, only 183,000 odd refugees per year get resettled in a third country like Canada. And in 2016, we sponsored the most refugees we ever had, which was 46,700, which again, incredibly generous, but a drop in the bucket if you look at the bigger picture. And this is when I want to come back to Ahmed Hussein's point about being vulnerable. So yes, we can celebrate all of our accomplishments, but we also have to keep in mind that the problems are very large, and we always have to challenge ourselves to do more. But I had the privilege, the last time I was in Vancouver, to meet my friend Jocelyn. And 10 years on, she was able to privately sponsor her family to come to Vancouver. So her 2 parents and her 6 siblings, who were still minors, were able to come to Canada and start a new life as well because of Jocelyn's efforts to privately sponsor refugees. And in fact, Canada is the only country in the world that allows private citizens, as well as the government, to sponsor refugees. The other things that we do is we work with the UNHCR to help refugees who are stuck in camps to have some sort of livelihood life. And we work to prevent wars from happening in the first place, which I think is one of the crucial actions to take as well. And finally, to return us to the Ghanaian High Commission, the story that I started with, I realized that maybe that one desk officer in Ghana wasn't entirely correct, because Canada does support refugees through development assistance. It doesn't matter if you're a refugee, if you are a citizen of a certain country, even if you're Canadian that needs a little bit of help. Development is about providing those helping hands so that every person can achieve their full potential. And that is what Aga Khan Foundation Canada does. So for example, I was working on a project with Aga Khan Foundation in Uganda in the north, right on the border between Congo and Sudan. And we were working to improve primary schools to make sure that teachers knew how to teach, that children learned and weren't just sitting in their classrooms, and that they could go on to secondary, to university, to provide for their families in the future. And these schools in northern Uganda were being flooded with refugees, in this case from South Sudan. So this development project was not only helping Ugandan children, but it was helping South Sudanese refugees as well. So finally, what can you do? So we always like to end these presentations with calls to action. I think it's fantastic that you're attending this conference here today. I would suggest what you've learned, taking that message out, bringing it to your friends and to your family, and encouraging them to get involved as well. We also have an Aga Khan Foundation Canada World Partnership Walk coming up. So it is in June. It's a 5-kilometer walk. You can raise awareness about some of the issues you've heard at this conference. You can raise funds. You can join the walk. And finally, once you head into university, you could consider joining the student refugee program that had such an impact on my own life. So I'm happy to take questions now, or please come and find me. I'm here until about lunch. I have brochures for you. I have more information about how you can join in this cause like you're already starting to do.
I think for sake of time, what we might do, only to keep things going, thank you very much, Hillary, is perhaps we will request that if you do have questions for Hillary, perhaps you can ask them of her at lunchtime. You had a fabulous presentation. And we'll do But at this point, I'll let Molly introduce, I'll let Molly thank Hillary and introduce the next section.
Thank you very much, Hillary, for sharing your experiences with us. It's very exciting to learn about what we can do as youth to help out. As many of you are aware, we have the privilege today to participate in a guided interactive exhibit put on by Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, who will help us better understand what it is like to become a refugee. After the youth conference today, MSF is hosting a free film screening of an important documentary about the migrant crisis called Human Flow. You are all invited to go to the Mayfair Theatre tonight at 5 p.m. on Bank Street to watch the film and hear the Q&A session with MSF staff who will be on hand. So here's the movie trailer for the film Human Flow.
Being a refugee is much more than a political status. It is the most pervasive kind of cruelty that can be exercised against a human being. You are forcibly robbing this human being of all aspects that would make human life not just tolerable but meaningful in many ways.
The more immune you are to people's suffering, that's very, very dangerous. It's critical for us to maintain this humanity.
همیشه 60 روز با پسرم همینطوری داریم میچرخیم ولی هیچ کس نیستش که بگه یه راهی رو بخواد به ما نشون بده. کجا برم زندگیمو شروع کنم؟
If children grow up without any hope, without any prospects for the future, without any sense of them being able to make something out of their lives, then they will become very vulnerable to all sorts of exploitation, including radicalization.
المرفد الوحيد غزة في السجن الكبير غزة مش في غزة السجن الكبير يعني.
The officials came here and told them, look, there's no way you're going to get papers to continue. Either you go voluntarily or we arrest you.
it's going to be a big challenge to recognize that the world is shrinking and people from different religions, different cultures are going to have to learn to live with each other.
So I hope to see you all there. Thank you for your attention during the keynote address. We will now take a 5-minute break to set up our panel discussion.
Or a 2-minute.
Or a 2-minute break.
Good point. Where's the... Yeah, it's it, actually. Yeah. Good point.
I think that was it.
Aim this one, that might go there. Oh, good. I found for a while I was having fits so I just find it's helping me.
that it doesn't matter. But because the MSF one is a little bit more flexible, taking what it is. Yeah, it's good. And
We're now ready to begin our panel discussion segment in the morning. We have brought together 3 experts today who have much to share about their experience work relating to mass atrocities, which create situations that render people refugees, as well as refugee protection within Canada, and the efforts in Canada to ensure that we screen migrants coming into our country to prevent any perpetrators of war crimes or crimes against humanity from coming to Canada. Please turn to the second page of your student workbook and feel free to take notes during these talks. You are welcome to jot down any questions you have, as on all 3 panelists will address the audience, we will hold a Q&A session for students. Our first panelist is Mr. Joseph Bertha. He is a retired legal counsel and a professor of international law. Next we have Mrs. Shireen Bensley Miller. She is a deputy chair refugee protection division. And we have Mr. Terry Beitner from War Crimes and Crimes against Humanity. I would like to invite you guys up.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. I recognize some of you from the library event a couple of weeks ago, so I'm glad you could make it again. I'm going to talk about a issue in refugee law that deals with children. The previous speakers, the Minister Hussein and Hillary, talked about the number of refugees that exist in the world. As you can see, the number of 32 million was already mentioned. What's not mentioned so far is how many of those refugees are actually children, first only 18 years old. And of those 11 million, 300,000 are unaccompanied, as the minister was. Which means, and imagine the minister what it means. It means that people of children your age have no support. They are displaced from their own country, from their own family, from their own villages, and they either go to a country next door, or sometimes have to make a long, arduous, and dangerous journey to other countries, such as Europe or North America. With no support, with no safety guarantees, and they still make it. When the minister said he was a minor without his mother, try to mention what it means when they come from Somalia to Europe, to Canada, and what hardships he has to suffer. He crosses over, but it's amazing how many children who by themselves have to actually try to make ends meet and try to survive. In addition, and now you see the numbers the same on the screen, there's been also 300,000 children who were child soldiers. And that is the group I like to address. Because child soldiers, by the way, the numbers are not the same. Most child soldiers do not make it to refugee camps, at least alone make it to like Canada or Europe or North America, because child soldiers tend to be a very disadvantaged group. They tend to be shunned by their own people. They tend to be quite often threatened because they have joined groups, either terrorist groups or military groups, and quite often have been used to victimize their own family, their own culture, and their own groups. So they're not exactly welcome later on in the communities they have left to attack. So they don't have the means, in most cases, to be coming from where they have gone back to come to other countries like Canada or Europe. Now, where do you find child soldiers? So you can see they're not confined to a small number of countries. Most of them you see in a small band in Africa, varying from Sierra Leone in the west to South Sudan in the east. Now, South Sudan is in red because that country has the largest number of child soldiers. You might have looked at the news this week and you see that South Sudan is making a very strenuous effort to mobilize and integrate child soldiers from the various armed groups. And this week was a report that the number of 2,000 of the soldiers, about like 20,000 in South Sudan, having actually been demobilized. But you also see countries in South America, which is Colombia, the Middle East, specifically Yemen, and also in Asia, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and even the Philippines. So it's a widespread phenomenon. 300,000 child soldiers in 2015. And the next picture I'd like to show, I want to show you what it's like to be a child soldier and what the dilemma is to be a child soldier. Look at the picture on the right. You see a young boy with a gun pointing at you. At the same time, he's wearing a pink teddy bear backpack. And that's the essence of child soldiers. They're children. They still believe in children emotions, in children aspirations. At the same time, they're being trained to shoot at people. And that's the dilemma that children face, and it's the dilemma that's being faced when they come to other countries. What do you do with a child who has been often forcibly recruited? In other words, most children do not voluntarily become part of an armed group or a terrorist organization. They quite often, majority of cases, they've been actually grabbed off the streets,
They're grabbed out of villages from family and forcibly taken to a camp to become a child soldier. In order, and those are children as young as 11. And by the way, both pictures you see boys. However, it's definitely not uncommon to also have girls recruited in armed forces. And I'm going to explain a little bit how precarious existence is for boys. You can imagine for girls it's even worse. But let me talk about the boys first. A typical way for a child to become a child soldier, first he or she is forcibly recruited, taken away by violence, with violence means quite often protesting. I've seen videos where children have been struggling and being held down by 4 or 5 adult soldiers to the back of a truck to take it to a camp. But in the camp, they're brutalized, they're terrorized, they are beaten daily, because what the leaders of these groups want, they want to have children who are compliant in order to carry out orders which quite often brutal, inhumane, and terrible to carry out. So there are conditions, and the conditions are conditioned by being beaten and being starved, and often they're also plied with alcohol or drugs in order to make them more compliant. When I say drugs, this is not that they're being given like soft drugs to eat with their meals. No, often they're forcibly injected with like very strong drugs, and often forcibly injected in their heads in order to make sure they take those drugs and that the drugs are as efficient as possible. So they're now being recruited in an armed group organization or terrorist organization, and then they get into weapons training. Then they're used basically as cannon fodder. Some children are being used at the base camp for menial tasks, but often they're taken out in battle. And they're the ones who can be dispensed with, because the adults want to carry on. They're the ones who have to know the tactics, they're the ones who know the territory. So the children being used as cannon fodder. They're often sent in first in a battle with usually weapons which are far inferior to what they're facing by organized military government troops. So they die in high numbers. Before they get to that point, they often have to show the loyalty to the armed groups. The loyalty might very well include that they're taken back to their home village and they are forced to kill people they know, sometimes the family, in order to ensure they will not escape and go back to their own village, because they will not be welcome there at all, as you can imagine. So that is, so they're severely traumatized, severely victimized. If those children would make it to a refugee camp, would make it to Europe or Canada, clearly they fit all the requirements, all the hallmarks of being a refugee. When we walked in, you saw the University of the Declaration of Human Rights, the UNDR, Article 14, that says anybody is entitled to become a refugee. So they, based on this aspect, there should be no doubt that they are refugees. However, they're also used to commit crimes. They commit atrocious crimes because, one, they are on influence of alcohol or drugs. Two, they are forced. They are told, if you do not carry out our orders, you might be killed. I know of stories where a child said, well, I wanted to escape, but some of my friends did try to escape. They came back and they were tortured, severely beaten, or even killed. So I do not want to try it again. But in the meantime, they have to carry out sometimes terrible, terrible crimes. So here's the dilemma in this picture. You have a child who has gone unimaginable cruelties, unimaginable treatments. At the same time, he commits one of the worst crimes known to mankind. You saw the background of the person who started this program, talking about crime against humanity. Those children have been involved in crime against humanity. And the question is, how do you deal with a dilemma like that? How do you deal with children who on one hand are severely persecuted, on other hand, have been involved in very serious crimes. My time is limited, but briefly, this issue has been looked at both in Canada, United States, and other countries in Europe. And UNHCR, as it was referred to in Hillary's presentation, has actually a guideline how to deal with children. And they try to balance those guidelines and decisions in Europe and North America, try to balance the fact that children in this situation, first of all, don't have the same capacity of reasoning as adults. Secondly, is compromised by the way they're treated. But they commit crimes. How do you balance that? And very briefly, what the guidelines and decisions say in Europe and North America is that if the activities you've been involved in are fairly minor, then the balance goes towards being persecuted and you get refugee status in the country. However, if you've been involved in a large number of crimes and you cannot point as a child to circumstances that says I was forced and I have no choice, you often are not entitled to refugee status. The same slide of Article 14 of the Universal Declaration says everyone is entitled to refugee status unless, there's an exception in the Universal Declaration, unless you committed serious crimes. So countries have at times what they call excluded children who get refugee status. And then they're going to be in limbo. And eventually they'll be returned to the exact situation where they came from. There's no good solution to resolve this. But I'm happy to say that more and more countries, and I'm not talking about countries that are using UNHCR to help out refugees, but countries like Canada, they're getting more sympathetic for children, and more the essence of the aspect of the persecution starts to prevail. At the same time, try to help the children with the trauma and trying to get them over the situation they have to endure. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, before we start, can I just hear from my alma mater, Glebe Collegiate? Are you here? There's only 3 of you? Hi. I actually went there before your parents. Anyway, yeah, I'm just saying. So I'm from the Immigration and Refugee Board, which is a tribunal. So it's a decision-making body, and it's the body that decides whether or not somebody actually will get refugee status in Canada. So refugees, as you heard, migrate, they travel, they go to many countries, and then eventually they end up here. Now, there are 2 ways to become a refugee in Canada. You could be determined to be a refugee in a refugee camp, like the one we heard about earlier, and that's done by the Immigration and Refugee and Citizenship Canada Department, and they make the decision abroad. Or you can actually come to the border and declare yourself to be a refugee, or come as a visitor and go to an inland office and ask for refugee asylum. So if you're somebody in need of protection and you end up in Canada, somebody has to make the decision as to whether or not you meet the test for refugee status. Because if you came to Canada, for example, where you weren't in need of protection because you wanted to come here for a better life as an immigrant and you wanted to just work in Canada, you don't actually qualify under the convention as a refugee or a person in need of protection. So that's an important thing to understand. So the board was set up in 1989 so that somebody like a judge could make the decision as to whether or not you are a refugee and whether or not you're going to be given protection in Canada. And we use all the same principles that courts use, the principles of natural justice. People who are in Canada are protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So there's a duty owed of care that we will actually listen to each individual's story and make the determination as to whether or not they are really somebody who will be subject to persecution if they are returned to their home country. And that's really the test that we have to look at when we decide whether or not somebody meets the International Convention standard for refugee protection. And so the tribunal is a little bit of a bubble. We're just the decision maker. We don't do any settlement assistance or resettlement assistance. We don't do anything about, getting people into schools or helping them find medical attention. We really just make the decision as to whether or not somebody is or is not a refugee. It's actually a difficult process for somebody to go through, as you can imagine, to try and make their case to explain why it is that they think they're going to be persecuted. Often they're people who have come with very little documentation. They have very little proof of what's happened to them. You know, somebody might come and say, I'm being threatened by the Taliban because I have been helping NGOs in Afghanistan. And they don't really necessarily have any proof. They might try to get letters, for example, from the NGO to attest to the fact that they were working for that NGO in Afghanistan. But sometimes it's very difficult. So just try and think of your own situation when you're trying to attest to something you've done or someplace you've been, and there's nobody really around to corroborate the evidence. It's very difficult to make that case. So most people who appear before us actually have legal counsel to help them make the case and to try and help them get the evidence they need in order to prove the case. We have about 130 decision makers spread across the country. We have offices in Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. We're actually going to be opening an office here in Ottawa for a couple of years because, as you may have heard, we've had a huge increase in the number of people making refugee claims here in Canada. It's interesting because some people are coming across the border. You may have seen it in the newspapers. Have been coming across the border irregularly is the language that we use, because they're not using the ports of entry. So I'm sure you've all crossed a border at a port of entry where there are members of border security people who ask you questions. You know, how long are you traveling for? Are you bringing in anything over a certain amount? Have you bought anything in the foreign country? Those are border agents, and they run the ports of entry. But Canada has a big, long border that doesn't have ports of entry everywhere, so people are crossing in places where we don't have official points of entry. And when they do that, this is something that actually makes me very proud to be Canadian. When they do that, a lot of countries would just put barbed wire or maybe fences. You might have heard of some countries who are thinking of building fences. Yeah, we're not thinking of building fences, and we're not doing that. So, but usually when you get to a border crossing, like the one in Quebec that you're hearing about a lot at Roxham Road, there's a big ditch. And I mean a big ditch, like 20 feet deep. It's full of, well, probably like garbage and weeds, and it's just muddy and gross and yucky. And people were crossing, basically dropping into that ditch and then climbing out to come into Canada. And most countries, if people are crossing in places where they don't officially want them to cross, might fill that ditch with barbed wire, might put police or soldiers on the Canadian side and give them large weapons and dogs and try and scare people from doing that. But that's not the Canadian way. The Canadian way at Saint-Bernard-de-la-Colle was the village got together. It's just a small village in Quebec, and it got together and they said, wow, you know, people are really crossing through this ditch, and you know, pregnant women and old people and children are crawling down into the ditch and then having to crawl back out, and it's very demeaning and kind of awful. And so the little town got together and they built a path so it's wheelchair accessible. So as a Canadian, we don't put down barbed wire, we actually build a path. So now there's a path across that ditch. And the police who stand on this side, the RCMP, who really have a legal obligation to arrest people who cross the border without permission, they actually stand on the Canadian side. Actually, it's funny, so I'm talking to the police officers who are there, and they said, you know, we've changed what we do at the border. You're welcome to come in. Please, feel free. We've changed what we do at the border. We used to just wait for people to cross, and then we would tell them they were arrested, but particularly young men would get across the ditch and they would just start running, and then we'd have to run after them and basically jump on them, and we couldn't figure out like what was going on, and we thought somebody's going to get hurt, police officers, refugees, somebody's going to get hurt. So he said we actually sat down with a bunch of these young men and said, like, why are you running? And they said, oh, because the agents have told us that we have to make sure that we make our claim on Canadian soil. So we want to make sure that we're in Canada, so we run to make sure that we've actually crossed that border. So the RCMP changed their tactics, and now they stand on the Canadian side and they shout across to the people who are getting out of taxis and crossing, getting ready to cross the border, and they shout, hi, we're standing in Canada. This is Canada. So that they're making it really clear that this side of the ditch is Canada. And then they say, and when you come across, we will have to arrest you. Do you understand? And people say yes. and then they say, you know, can we help you with your bag? So we've taken a different approach, an approach that is much more Canadian, much more polite. I heard a story from a member of parliament who had been visiting the Emerson, in Emerson, Manitoba. There's also a place where people have been crossing irregularly. You probably read about some of the tragedies that took place there during the winter, a few winters ago, where people lost fingers and somebody died, and really terrible things happened. But so the member of parliament went out there to actually meet with some of the people who had made refugee claims at that point in the border. And he said, you know, he was talking to these refugees, and it was 3 young men, and they had come a very long distance, and they had walked from South America, and they had crossed a lot of borders. And they said, so when they got to the Canadian border, they were very nervous, because in all the borders they had crossed, they had not been very well received, and the treatment had not been very nice. So they were very nervous when they saw the police were waiting for them on the Canadian side of the border. And they said, but the experience was so different, because the first 2 questions that the RCMP asked them was, do you need a doctor, and have you eaten? And they said that was really shocking to them, because those were not the first 2 questions that other police forces had asked. So it is true that when somebody crosses irregularly, they will get arrested, they will get assessed, but refugees actually are entitled really to cross anywhere, so it's not a criminal offense. So we do call it illegal crossing or irregular border crossing, but it's not actually something that we persecute. Once you've made a refugee claim, you then get referred to the IRB for your hearing. We make about 23 to 25,000 decisions a year, but we currently have a 50,000 case backlog. So we've been given some money in this last year's budget to get more members, to be able to make more decisions, so that we can figure out whether or not somebody really is a refugee, or whether they need to go back to their own country, or whether they need to find a way to come to Canada through another immigration process. Because there are a number of ways to come into Canada. Refugee status is just one. So I'm going to leave it there, because I think that I've probably taken enough time, and I'd like to have time for questions later. So that's kind of what I do.
Oh yeah, it's on. Okay, my presentation, my name is Terry Beitner. My presentation is a little more interactive, and I do need that, and I need to see where I'm at, so forgive me for walking around a little bit. I'm from the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes section of the Department of Justice, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more later on about the work that we do as part of the War Crimes program. And what we're involved in is screening people who come to Canada, either as refugees, students, immigrants, business people. And what we're part of is a larger screening process to make sure that people who are involved in criminal activity do not actually make it into Canada. And the government of Canada screens for all kinds of criminality. Today, I'm just going to talk to you about the criminality relating to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I'm also only obviously going to focus on the refugee flows and how the screening and the dynamics and how it is that war criminals sometimes come in with the flow of refugees from war-torn countries. So before I get started, I just want to define a couple of terms. And when we say war criminal, it means that we have individuals who did not obey the law of armed conflict. So yes, of course, even during wars, during armed conflict, there's a set of rules. And the rules are pretty basic. There are many rules, but there are some very basic rules that are very, very simple to understand. And if you break these rules, it is a war crime. So the basic, the 2 of them that I'll talk to you very, very briefly to set the context, the 2 rules are distinction and proportionality. Very, very simple. Distinction. You do not intentionally target civilians or civilian objects. You distinguish between civilians and military or military objects. And the second rule is also extremely important. It is acknowledged during wartime that civilians may get killed. And the proportionality principle means that you have to limit the amount of civilians by measuring the manner in which you're going to execute your military options. So for example, a convoy of military vehicles, tanks, soldiers, what have you, have to travel from a military base through a city to the front lines. And the military convoy is a legitimate target. So you can fly your planes if you're engaged in an armed conflict, and you could bomb the convoy that's driving through a city. The idea, when you apply the proportionality principle, is to minimize the amount of civilian casualties that you may cause. And that means that you're not going to bomb the convoy as it's driving through a residential neighborhood. So the convoy goes through a residential neighborhood, then an industrial neighborhood. So you'll bomb it. The idea is the military will target the convoy as it goes through an industrial neighborhood or a low population, a low civilian population neighborhood. Doesn't mean that there may not be any civilian casualties, but the proportion of civilian casualties to the military objective has to be small. So, very simply, if you target civilians, or if you are reckless in the use of force that you apply, you're committing war crimes. So Canada, the principle, the policy that we operate on is that Canada will not be a safe haven for war crimes or war criminals. So let's take the scenario. This is a classic military or armed conflict scenario where you have two countries, A and B. Now, A wants to invade B and take that portion of country B because historically they felt that they had a claim. They may have occupied that territory, but they have a historic claim. So A invades B. And you have a war going on in B's territory. Now, A not only wants to take that portion of country B, but along with its historic claims to the land, they want to purify the land of all those citizens, all the blue citizens from country B. So what do? They employ methods to terrorize the population of those people that they don't want to remain in that territory after the war is over. So they'll target civilians. They'll target civilian objects. They'll bomb hospitals or they'll bomb schools to terrorize the population so that it will be ethnically pure after the war is completed. Now, because of the atrocities that are going on, because of the war, the instability, the people in country B feel, especially those that were attacked in that area where there was battle, feel that they're being bombed and shelled and killed because of, let's say, their ethnicity. And they feel that their country cannot protect them. So they feel that they're being persecuted. And this is the classic refugee test, that you cannot be protected at home, and that you're being persecuted for some quality, usually ethnicity. So this creates refugees. Canada, being a refugee receiving country, will receive refugees and they'll settle, they'll stay here, become permanent residents, and then eventually they'll become citizens. Now we go back to the war, and as happens, the tides turn on country A. Now country B has invaded. And now the armed conflict, the military front has moved into country A. And country A, having withstood the terror country B, having withstood the terror that country A imposed upon them, now country B exacts its revenge. So now you have more war crimes being committed in a vengeful fashion. You did it to us, we're going to do it to you. And the example that I'm telling you is not fictional. This is how events occur in many recent conflicts. The front changes, and then the terror goes the other way. Now back at home in Canada, years later, we now have refugees from both sides of the conflict. And now we return, and peace has been restored. Let's say country A, country B everything's cool, the war is over. However, in both countries, you have people who may have committed the atrocities on either side. And now, since the regimes may have changed, and maybe the countries are still unstable, but these criminals feel extremely insecure because they may be prosecuted, not persecuted, but prosecuted for the crimes that they may have committed. And that now what we have is that some of those war criminals leave their country among the masses of refugees that leave. Now you'll have some war criminals who sneak in. A very small amount, I assure you. In Canada and most refugee-receiving states take measures to screen out criminals of all sorts, but especially war criminals, but we can't be 100% effective. So I started with the No Safe Haven principle, and that's where my office, working with the RCMP and the Immigration Services of Canada come in, will receive allegations from people who will phone up the police, and we have very recently received allegations in the nature of the following scenario. You know, a woman gets on the bus in a Western Canadian city, and she recognizes a man that comes on the bus who, in the country that she sought refuge from, was among the people that came to her town and detained her, brought her to a place where obviously terrible things had happened. And she's on a city bus, and obviously she freaks out. And it was such a terrible story that he sees her and he points to her, he recognizes her, and has the gall to scare her, almost threaten her. He says her name, and she loses it. She gets off the bus, and then she reports this to a local police, and then eventually makes its way over to the War Crimes Program. And what we do is we try to digest all of these allegations and pick the appropriate remedy, which might be a criminal investigation to prosecute the person here in Canada, or most often to locate the individual and to strip the person of whatever status that the person may have secured to get into Canada. I'm going to stop there now, and then perhaps we'll take questions after. Thank you.
Thank you to our three panelists. Those were very interesting presentations. Now, please review your notes, and should you have any questions, please make your way to the microphones, or I'll ask who it is. Be sure to let us know to whom you are asking your question. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi. Well, I was just wondering for Mr. Baker.
Yeah.
Well, looking back to Mr. Rickoff's child soldiers, how do we in Canada treat them? So let's say they perpetrated, they did something, a crime in Canada, but knowing their circumstances, how do we in Canada treat them?
So the way that the matter is examined will follow the basic principles. So let's say an investigation may be lost, so by the time individuals will come into Canada, it won't be many years after, so now they present themselves as adults. It's very unlikely that they'll be here as children at that age. So they'll be here as adults, and we'll conduct an investigation to determine, first of all, whether the facts are so that there are reasonable grounds to believe that they were involved and meet the legal threshold of potentially taking some kind of legal action against them. But at the same time, when we consider their culpability, we'll also determine whether there are defenses, whether there are reasons along the lines of what Joseph had mentioned. Was there a duress applied to such a degree, and do we believe that that duress continued during the commission of crimes, and those will be weighed? It doesn't mean that, as Joseph had mentioned, that just because the person was a child soldier and forcibly recruited, that you get a buy. We have to examine the facts in quite a while.
Thank you.
We'll come over to the side now.
I have a question for Mr. Rakoff. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the new Canadian military doctrine concerning child soldiers, and I was wondering if you thought that this doctrine is adequate enough to apply to peacekeeping missions in areas that have large concentrations of child soldiers.
This doctrine, as well as the work by General Laurierlive, who was involved in developing the policy, they are very much, the Canadian policy with the military doctrine is very much trying, first of all, to prevent children to enter military groups that might then engage in atrocities. And secondly, if they have then become part of those groups, try to find a way to de-escalate the conflict they're in, demobilize, and then also integrate in the population. What the doctrine, as I understand it, wants to do is, when they go overseas, to ensure that they're working with local communities, because quite often the local communities are already involved, when child soldiers are involved in armed conflict, to when they come back. The biggest problem that children face is that since they're being used against their own communities to integrate. And I was doing a presentation referring to girls. Girls often, when they are forcibly recruited, they not only are involved in either armed conflict or doing support functions, they also often been made what are called bushwives. They've been assigned to one particular adult fighter, and they basically do household chores and also rape on a regular basis. When they come back to the community, they are seen as traitors, because it sounds they voluntarily became a wife of an adult soldier. So it takes a lot of time to actually integrate those girls and the boys back in the community. And Canadian policy is to assist local communities. So it's partially prevention. If you know that children are at risk, whatever you can do in that local context to avoid getting those children into armed groups. And as I think Hillary referred to that, not also the introduction to the movie, try to make sure they don't radicalize. Try to make sure that they have alternatives to go to the military, because it's not just a matter of it sounds very cruel to be a military. They also provide like traineeship, food and shelter. So try to deal with those issues. And I believe that's what the military policy is trying to support, especially what General Valera is doing, working with an NGO in exactly that.
So do you think the doctrine is adequate enough to apply to UN peacekeeping missions?
I'm glad I'm retired. I don't, because there's another dilemma. I think you seem to be talking in dilemmas. The dilemma of these peacekeepers is that while they're trying to keep the peace, there have been a number of instances where peacekeepers themselves engaged in criminal activities, particularly using young boys and girls as prostitutes. So that the United States is taking steps to counter that, but it is a bit contradictory to send peacekeepers and at the same time try to prevent them from children to get armed forces by such a problem going on. So I think it's a very good first step. It has to be replicated by other countries that send peacekeepers, and it has to be enforced much more strenuously, I think. So it's a very good step. I think in the beginning it will be difficult to actually see some successes.
Hello, my name is Edna Rodriguez. I am from Colonel By Secondary School, and my question is directed to Ms. Miller. So the United States is currently in the process of revoking TPS and other protection policies for various ethnic groups that went there after a crisis. How are they able to do so since they are under the UDHR, like since they are legally binded by the UDHR? And how does their system work in contrast to what your tribunal does?
That's a very good question. The question of how governments can make decisions that are consistent with their international obligations is really one of politics, and I'm not a politician, so I can't even venture to guess how they do it, but they just do. Because essentially governments can have a lot of power, and partly this is because the international conventions are based on the concept of the world being part of an international family, and every country that signs on to an international convention does so based on their own respect for the rule of law. So it's just essentially respect for the principle, or maybe not. I can't really comment on that. This kind of conference is actually super important to instilling in all of us as citizens and as voters the importance of respecting these things, because there's no gun to our head that makes us accept refugees and to protect people who are in need of asylum. We do that because it's a defining value for us. It's something that we as individuals hold dear, and that's what we vote for, and that's what we support, and that's the kind of Canada that we create. So it's really important for you and your friends and your family members to be aware of these things, because it's very easily lost. If people don't understand the importance of protecting others, then we won't. So it's really important to have that. So that would be the first thing. In terms of the obligations of a tribunal like the one that I belong to, essentially we are the rule of law. We sit down and look at the legislation, the international obligations, the various principles, and then we look at the evidence, like judges do in criminal court or in other judicial settings. We look at the evidence in front of us, and then we get to make a decision independently. So while Minister Houston is the minister for the immigration and refugee system, he does not direct me or any of my members as to what kinds of decisions we need to make or we can make. We make those decisions as independent adjudicators. So I don't take instructions from anybody. And just so that you know, because when you're reading the newspaper, you might read about some adjudicators who always decide yes, somebody's a refugee, and other adjudicators that always decide no. And it's true, individual members will have individual views. We try to hire for people who understand the values and understand the rule of law and have an understanding of administrative law principles. But different people interpret it differently. And the truth is, there's nothing I can do about that variance, because part of the essential element of a tribunal is that each decision maker gets to make the decision based on their own assessment of credibility, their own judgment, and their own sense of the evidence before them. So I can't substitute my views of a case for that of one of my adjudicators.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Aisha. I attend Osgood Township High School, and my question is directed at Mr. Rickhoff. So, do you know what is being done by the UN or countries like Canada in hopes of tackling the issue of child soldiers?
Well, there was already one question asked about what the military is doing. I suspect that Hillary has more to say about that. I mean, there are general programs to work with refugees. Like Canada supports UNHCR, the United Nations. When the Canadian government, through high commissions, as Hillary said, does work as well, I do not think of a program that specifically addresses child soldiers as such. I remember one time when I was still working for the government, and in Sierra Leone war was over, a brutal war in Sierra Leone with a lot of child soldiers. And the number of children were being demobilized, disarmed, and integrated with some difficulty. And the question was asked of the government, this is over 10, 15 years ago, whether or not Canada would want to accept child soldiers to actually come to Canada. And eventually it was decided that it would be better if Canada provided money to local organizations rather than bring them here and then having a recruiting situation while being traumatized and try to integrate here. And my understanding is that it is expensive to have children come here and actually go through the process. My understanding is that Provo was quite successful in Sierra Leone, that a lot of children went through to the demobilization and integration, to the extent that later on when children have come independently in Sierra Leone and they claim refugee status, they'll be told, you don't feel persecution anymore. The situation has improved, so you can actually go back to Sierra Leone. So all to say is that I'm not aware of specific programs when there are ad hoc needs. Canada try to support, usually through the regular programs and the regular UN agencies.
So unfortunately, because of our time, you get the last question for today.
Hello, I'm Maddie. I'm from Longfield Stakes and Heights Secondary School. I just have a question for Ms. Miller. So I was actually wondering, it was mentioned that people who come to the immigration board to be judged whether they are a refugee or not, and if they're allowed to come. I think it was mentioned that they were allowed legal counsel. So is that legal counsel that they have to afford themselves, or is it provided?
That's a great question. Because as you can imagine, a lot of people who come as refugees to make claims are in reduced circumstance, so they are actually eligible for a lot of things. So when somebody comes as a refugee, they almost instantly, whatever province they land in, they get a work permit, they're eligible for social assistance, social housing, and they also usually have access to legal aid. So most of the lawyers we do have some that are actually privately paid counsel, but the majority of counsel that appear before us are actually subsidized through legal aid. So that's a very good question, but you can imagine that is part of the social fabric that we provide as Canada, is that we respect the fact that if somebody's making a claim like this, they are a vulnerable person. If they're a person in need of protection, they probably haven't come with much, and we have a responsibility as a society then to help them to make this claim in a way that is legitimate, so that they have every chance of actually proving the case that they want to make or need to make.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again to all of our panelists and to the LGBTQ students today. We're now ready to make our way to our first workshop of the day. So with the student with the orange colored sheet, please.
She just finished her PhD in Oxford on
to have yellow for focus. Also, to the MSF mini tent city refugee exhibit in April. In the section about refugee agencies, and there's 7 agencies with us today, and there's different questions to answer for each agency, so you'll have to circulate between the different tables to find the answers to those questions. I believe 5 of the agencies will be out in the main hall, and then a couple will be in here as well, so you can make your way out. Once again, everybody in the green room is welcome to That is the main home.
We do have kind of limited space where the agencies are. So what I would suggest is perhaps we do have one agency that's setting up here, so you'll definitely get to see this one. If you want to have a seat and just rest for a few minutes, I will then, once enough people have started to go through the agencies, I'll cycle through the people who've seen the tables and have you guys go out, okay? Just because I'm worried about how much space there is for you. So you can rest for a few minutes.
What's that?
Oh, really? Can handle it? Yeah. It was a. Yeah, it was a 1080p.
All right, so folks, in your student workbook, you'll see that there is a section for the CCIJ Canadian Center for Social Justice. They are set up here in the auditorium, so I don't think we should let everybody going to talk to them right now, but you are welcome to kind of go up in small groups to find out what the Canadian Center for International Justice does to support refugees across Canada.
But like we're talking about the subject of child abuse. These guys are commanders or generals, right? They're obviously not children. There you go. So what about the children that come in?
Oh, well.
We don't.
Yeah, I hate like live off the floor sound, the tinniness.
It was not. It was okay. Yeah, it's not great.
In this room for like a theater, it is so weird in terms of.
No, and it depends on what you spend.
Exactly. But what's really nice about this is if you have no mics, the natural acoustics are very good.
Okay.
But as soon as you start amplifying them, yeah, wherever you're standing with the mic or sitting, it sounds totally different. Did you have lots of online viewers? Right. Right.
We don't have this one on we also record
Oh, so it's documented.
Where you want Is we good?
So is he using based
No, it's no. He's done, I think. So now we're back to this.
You just said is he good? Thank you.
What can't what?
Did what?
So in that sense, like it's not in like some people take cases that seem to be domestic. I work for my pilot sometimes. So yeah, it's we don't do
Are you just like a representative for the
Canadian Center for International Justice. Yeah, I'm an artist student. Right. Oh, okay. I just finished my law degree and now I'm doing
what section of law?
Yeah, like international. I'm with Yale.
Great. So,
genocide. Do you guys have like an idea? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. No, I mean basically. Yeah. So I'll divide the gender. Yeah. Was like one of the first international conventions. May have actually been the first. Okay. And so they basically define genocide as it's basically so they divide the crime into two parts. There's the action and then there's the intention behind the action. So the actions can be murder, it can be imposing very destructive conditions on a group of people, it can be taking away children from a group of people, it can be not allowing them to have children in the first place. And the intention behind that has to be to destroy that group of people. So there's kind of two components to it. There has to be a clear intention to destroy that group of people, and then those actions. Yeah.
And what does the CCIG do to help the refugees survive?
Yeah.
The universal.
I mean, because I'm always looking for.
So we work with a lot of refugees, not all of our students are refugees, but a lot of them are. And a lot of them are in Canada, but not all of them. And so, yeah, so we provide legal support to people who are survivors of police crime. So that can mean a whole bunch of different things. One of them is the domestic court system in Canada. So
just station to station. Means that there's no purpose for us to stream there.
Trying to get
So what we're going to do, let's stop the stream and start recording.
If there's a war criminal